First of all, thank you both for joining us today to have this really important and relevant discussion. So the way that I would like to start things off is just for both of you to introduce yourselves and, tell us a little bit about your personal story.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share some time with y'all. I am a TEDx motivational speaker. I am a CEO of the Alicia Anderson Company. I'm a disability advocate. I have award-winning diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, and I speak to companies globally about disability inclusion in the workplace. I just launched Pushing Forward with Alicia podcast today. So if you're looking for content or a speaker that is focused on anything DEI and disability related, please reach out to me. My history is I was born with my disability. I live with something called sacroiligenesis, which has led me to live my life from a wheelchair. And from disability and inclusion in the workplace, I've studied it, I have degrees in it, and I've lived it. So I'm speaking to companies globally today about how to advance that conversation. I'm also a former VP of sales in multifamily housing. So I do have about 18 years of experience of what that looks like kind of in the industry that we're focused on today. So I'm excited to expand that conversation. So thank you so much for including me.
Wonderful. Dani?
Hey, okay, so I'm Inman senior editor, and I also run our contributors program. And the reason I'm on this call is because I am a wheelchair user, and I have been for about 20 years. In 2002, I had a sledding accident that landed me in a T12 L1 spinal cord injury, which is a fancy way of saying that my spinal cord was injured just enough to where I can't walk, but I still have some movement and sensation. So I've been, what some people would say wheelchair bound, if you will. I like to say wheelchair user for about 20 years. And I'm also a homeowner, and I've built a house to kind of meet the specs that myself and my husband, who is 7'2", both need to kind of address our very different needs.
Okay. Is your husband literally 7'2"?
Yeah, literally 7'2".
Wow.
So, in today's discussion, we're going to kind of cover three different areas. And there are specific areas that a lot of people aren't really maybe taking in consideration in their everyday business practices, especially in our audience. And we're trying to build awareness around this. So if you could, why don't you both talk about what it's like to just work in a professional sense and some things that you've noticed and maybe some barriers or challenges that you face?
Okay, so right now I've worked at Inman for coming up on 9 years, and I've been virtual the entire time. So my in-person work experience was in sales, selling cosmetics, and then before that, household goods, and then before that, I worked in restaurants. All from wheelchairs. And there's definite misconceptions and a lot of ignorance out there about just ability in general. And then working from home, I think you get a little bit of a different vibe because, you're at a computer. So your ability is based on kind of your fingertips and what you're able to process. And I think the piece that people don't talk about is that when let's say to go to the bathroom, for instance, to walk away to go to the bathroom for me may look very different than for somebody else. And those are the kind of things that I don't think your average person necessarily takes into consideration. So there's that, there's, making a meal might take a little bit longer, taking care of my children might take a little bit longer, etc.
A lot of extra steps.
And figuring it out, figuring out the logistics takes up a lot of bandwidth in my brain.
And I think a huge barrier in that is creating environments that are accessible and are taking into consideration the diversity and the just the uniqueness that each person has in their own ability, whether they have a physical disability like us, or like a visible disability, or the whole invisible or non-apparent disability that is 80% of people with disabilities that are walking in your door. And I think that there's not only physical barriers out there that are blocking us from participating in the workplace or finding housing or any of it, which would be like infrastructure or technology that's accessible or having the proper equipment, but also like attitudes and false perceptions on what people think about disability and what we can or cannot do. And then from a housing perspective, like social barriers, like lack of housing is a real thing, education on that, employment and opportunities of education, like all of that in our society is built around like the check off the box able body. And the reality is disability is the largest marginalized group. It's 1/7 of our global population. So people with disabilities are crossing our paths all the time. And these barriers like policy and communication, and there's many that kind of become this blockade to inclusion for people with disabilities to find the job they want, to have the, life experiences they would like, because typically we as a society are looking at disabilities inclusion as something that we need to check off the box, but not like looking at the whole human experience.
And we're kind of in this positioning right now. We're in this really strange kind of environment where there's more pushback against extra steps and extra measures for diversity, equity, inclusion. There's more pushback about having people return to traditional work office spaces. And I think one thing that the pandemic kind of shone a light on is that, a lot of traditional office space jobs actually could be performed very well from a remote work situation. So I think we're really fighting against two different mindsets in the culture right now. And I just think it's really interesting to hear your all's perspectives on that. When you guys are coming just like even into office spaces, or if you were looking to work somewhere, what are some things that you would need to consider that maybe brokers and team leaders would even think about when they're choosing commercial office space?
It's like so for sure, like the typical things, right? Is the ramp there? Is there larger restrooms? Are there the
doors?
The ADA compliance, that is the check off the box, right? Like, are we doing the bare minimum? Because that is what ADA is. But we need to think beyond that, right? Like under the ADA now is website accessibility and technology. And there's so many tools and infrastructure and accessibility, like freedoms that we need to be able to do the job equitably in a work environment. And so it goes beyond just the ramp. It's like, are we looking at the big picture? Are we creating an environment for our customers on our front end? So our websites for, are they accessible for visual impaired or hearing impaired or whatever? There's a massive span to the back end. Are we creating an environment that is inviting for employees to access not only our building, but our products, our tools, so they can perform at their most optimal level. So it really is an overall philosophy, not a check off the box, move on. Things are constantly changing. So companies need to be nimble and bake accessibility into their philosophy. And when you do that, you get companies like Microsoft, or there's these large companies that are baking this in, and it's creating innovation and more customers because we all choose these things. Accessibility design is a path of least resistance. It's when you're thinking about how things work for everyone, that's the easiest way. That's why Dani and I wait in line for the larger restroom, and there aren't always handicap, like disability parking spaces, and because everybody wants to have these, it's the path of least resistance. So this should be an overall philosophy. And if you're baking that into your business in that way, you're creating a place of belonging for your employees and your customers to want to buy from you and work for you.
And the benefits you reap from that is that, yes, somebody may need a little bit more of something, but they also think about things in a way that you probably don't. And they bring all that problem solving to the table, and you're not getting that elsewhere. Like, I think about my daughter who's ADHD, for instance. She needs a little bit more time to process things. But the creativity and the stuff that comes out of her mouth is just like the most entertaining, amazing. I don't know. She's hard to pin down, but everything that she does is so amazing and delightful and wonderful. And I'm not saying that as a mom. I'm saying that as like, I'm actually like dumbfounded at the creativity that comes from her. Imagine if you could harness that in all of your employees. If it was an open space where you really could. Go ahead, Alicia. Sorry.
I love that you brought that up because, like from a housing perspective and working in the environment and in the industry for me for years, and I was in multifamily, so it was apartment buildings, but still it was in housing, and a lot of the compliance pieces are always there heavy. And I had been, when I started my career, I was excused out of leasing offices and excused out of buildings because they had been sued by ADA, literally had meetings in the grass, like as a professional human. To where we are today, like to your point, Dani, my last boss hired me. I used to hide my wheelchair on LinkedIn. I'd hide my wheelchair on hiring managers because I would think because of the stigma and bias, I wouldn't even get an opportunity to interview. So I show up. He didn't know I was going to be there in wheelchair. He hired me because he knew I had to be a good planner. He knew proficiency around planning and pre-planning, and to do the same job would translate. And that is the conversation in DEI today that we're having. How do we leverage our differences as attributes that propel our careers? And we need to start looking at disability in that bucket as well, of something that could be an advantage that you can leverage in your career as powerful.
You know, we were talking about in our pre-call, like the words that we're okay with. And I think, you know, I've thought about like, I don't love disability because I agree we need one label that we can use to like talk about it and all be comfortable with it. But I also don't love disability because it sounds like such a negative, whereas I'm not saying differently abled is the way to go, but differently abled is actually more accurate for me than, you know, disabled. I remember calling around trying to find jobs when I was maybe like 19, 20. And I called a hotel and I was like, hey, I hear you're looking for like receptionist help. And they were like, yeah, you can't do that. You can't make beds. And I was like, well, how do you know I can't make beds? I just think about all these times that I've been told no. And like knowing the brief amount of time I've known you, Alicia, I have a feeling that you're like me and that there's very few things you tell me no on. And
I think it's the assumptions and unknowns that society thinks that they're pretty sure about disability that is absolutely false perceptions, 100%. And we've been so afraid of this conversation. Language is so important, right? Like, and disability might be good for me and differently able might be good for you. And that is okay. And every time I speak, I get asked that question because people don't even want to say, don't even want to ask you what you're comfortable with to move forward to the next thing, you know? So we're stuck in this space of non-progression out of fear. And so like differently able is perfect for you. Like,
as long as we're moving forward and talking about it, I'm happy.
Yes, of course. Yes.
In a real way.
100%. Yes.